Oh, hi and welcome everyone. Greetings of solidarity. Welcome to the launching of the International League of People's Struggle commemoration of the 150th anniversary of the Paris Commune. The International League of People's Struggle, or ILPS, was founded in 2001 and is an international organization that seeks to coordinate anti-imperialist and democratic movements around the world. I'm Yasmin Ahmed from Revolutionary Eenheid, and I'll be your moderator for this event. Before we begin, some housekeeping. We have translations available in French, Spanish, and Bahasa. You can select the language you would prefer to listen in by clicking the interpretation button below on the Zoom menu to choose your preferred language. And I'm just going to give everyone a moment to do that and let the other interpreters also just give people those instructions.
Merci Yasmine. Vous pouvez choisir l'interprétation en bas de votre écran en français. Il est disponible en français, espagnol et anglais. Vous pouvez choisir français si vous voulez en bas de votre écran, interprétation. Thank you, Yasmin.
Thanks, Malcolm. And if our Spanish interpreter can also just give the instructions, we'll be ready to continue. Or I think they're already in the interpretation channel. But yeah, it's just to, hopefully everyone has now selected the interpretation channel that they want to be in. And also if you're listening in English, please also, it would be best if you select to be in that channel to avoid any difficulties further on. And just another housekeeping point for everyone tuning in on Zoom and on Facebook, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. You can put your after the speakers and reactors presentations, but you can already, as your questions arise, put your questions in the Q&A box. If you're on Zoom, it's at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And if you're on Facebook, just pop your question into the comment section. And with that done, let's proceed. So it's the 150th anniversary of the Paris Commune, and the significance, lessons, legacy, and continuing validity of the Paris Commune will again be debated in the media, in academics, by political parties, and in social movements. The Paris Commune demonstrated that the working class was capable of destroying the bourgeois state machinery and replacing it with a state ruled by the working class, a dictatorship over the exploiting classes and a democracy for the exploited classes. It's the first great milestone in the theory and practice of proletarian revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat. Marxism as a revolutionary theory of the proletariat found incontrovertible proof in the reality of the Paris Commune. So, to begin and welcome the speakers and participants, and to formally open the commemoration of the 150th anniversary of the Paris Commune, we'll hear from the sitting ILPS chairperson, Len Cooper.
Welcome to you all to the ILPS launch of the commemoration of the 150th anniversary of the celebrated and historic uprising of the working class of Paris in 1871, known as the Paris Commune. The Commune is celebrated and historic because it was the first example in history of an attempt to overthrow the rule of the bourgeoisie, the rule of capital, and to replace it with the rule of the proletariat, of the working class. The International League of People's Struggles, ILPS, commemorates this historic and brilliant event in human history because it was the first attempt by the toilers of the world to overthrow the rule of capital which at that time was quickly developing into its imperialist stage, the highest and final stage of capitalism. The ILPS seeks to end the scourge of imperialism and to end the wars, poverty, oppression, environmental destruction, and other mistreatments which come with it, studies the Paris Commune and other proletarian revolutions which seek to replace the dictatorship of capital and replace it with real people's democracy and progress. Anyone who's serious about a liberated world must study the lessons of the Paris Commune. At this launch of the commemoration of the Paris Commune, a prominent leader of the resurgent proletarian movement today, Professor Joma Sisson, who is also the long-time chairperson of ILPS and current chairperson emeritus, will be the first keynote speaker on the significance of the Paris Commune today. We look forward to that in the coming weeks and months. The ILPS commemoration will bring you further keynote speakers on the topics of workers' movements, the struggle of the European workers, women of the Paris Commune, applying the lessons of the Paris Commune, and a virtual tour of the Paris Commune. Theoretical and popular primers on the Commune will also be released in English, French, and Spanish. The ILPS is calling on its member organisations, country chapters, and other networks throughout the world to celebrate the victories of the Paris Commune by joining these activities and by launching their own activities in country regions and chapters. Please enjoy the commemoration of the 150th anniversary of the Paris Commune. Long live the Paris Commune, long live international solidarity. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Len. Now we'll proceed to the first of our guest speakers. We have with us Frans de Maagd to give us an introduction of the Paris Commune. Frans studied art history at the Ghent University. He worked for 5 years as a metal worker and a communist organizer in a Ghent company. And he's been giving lectures and speaking at conferences on Marxist theory of the state since 1986. He also organizes Marxist walks in Brussels and Paris city tours of the revolutions between 1789 and 1871. Over to you, Frans.
Bonjour, vous m'entendez?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, thank you. Tout d'abord, merci de m'inviter pour cette introduction. C'est un grand honneur pour moi, à partir de la Belgique, la petite Belgique. Je vais lire un texte parce que, pour être court, c'est très difficile de ne pas avoir un texte. Bon, la Commune de Paris a commencé le 18 mars 1871, on dit en Belgique 71. Bien que la Commune de Paris n'ait duré que 72 jours, elle a été la première révolution prolétarienne réussie, au cours de laquelle la classe ouvrière a détruit l'ancien pouvoir d'État bourgeois et établi un pouvoir ouvrier. Friedrich Engels appelle la Commune la dictature du prolétariat. Les soi-disant marxistes ne mentionnent jamais ce jugement d'Engels. Déjà pendant la Commune de Paris, alors que sa défaite était certaine, Karl Marx, dans son ouvrage « La guerre civile en France », soulignait l'importance historique de la Commune pour les communistes d'hier, d'aujourd'hui et de demain. Karl Marx écrivait en tant que président de la Première Internationale. Il disait « Même si la Commune est écrasée, la lutte ne sera que différée. » Pour préparer la révolution et le pouvoir soviétique, Lénine écrit pendant l'été 1917 « État et révolution », où il s'appuie sur l'expérience de la Commune de Paris. Les bolcheviks adopteront tous les aspects positifs de la Commune, en évitant tous les aspects négatifs. la Commune de Paris a été décisive pour le pouvoir soviétique. La Commune de Paris est née de la première guerre moderne franco-allemande de 1870 et de 1871. Pour empêcher l'unification de l'Allemagne sous Bismarck, Napoléon III avait déclenché une guerre contre la Prusse en juillet 1870. Mais Napoléon a été vaincu à la frontière franco-allemande à Sedan. Le peuple de Paris s'est directement révolté et a proclamé la Troisième République. Le gouvernement de défense nationale est dirigé malheureusement par la bourgeoisie. Au lieu de défendre la patrie, la bourgeoisie prépare la capitulation. À partir de septembre 1870, Paris est complètement encerclé par les Allemands. Afin de forcer Paris à capituler par la famine et les bombardements. Mais les Parisiens tiennent bon. Les riches avaient depuis longtemps fui la ville, tout comme le gouvernement de trahison. Les ouvriers sont armés. Il y avait au total presque 200 bataillons et plus de 100 000 gardes nationales. Ils avaient acheté eux-mêmes leurs propres canons pour défendre la ville. Mais le 28 février, le gouvernement de Thiers signe la capitulation avec l'Allemagne, avec des conséquences terribles pour la France et le peuple français. La perte d'Alsace-Lorraine et le paiement de 4 milliards d'impôts de guerre. Les Parisiens devaient aussi rendre les armes, ce qu'ils ont refusé. Le 18 mars, les troupes gouvernementales se faufilent dans Paris pour saisir les canons des communards sur la butte Montmartre. C'est là où se trouve maintenant l'affreuse église Sacré-Cœur. C'est raté. Paris se révolte et le soir, les insurgés occupent l'hôtel de ville et la garde nationale prend le pouvoir. Le 26 mars, il y a des élections. Sur les 86 élus, 30 sont membres de l'Internationale, mais les marxistes sont minoritaires parmi eux. L'une des premières mesures est l'abolition de l'armée permanente. Elle est remplacée par la milice populaire de la garde nationale. Les membres de la commune peuvent être écartés de leurs fonctions à tout moment. Ce sont pour la plupart des travailleurs ou des représentants reconnus de la classe ouvrière. La commune n'est pas un organe parlementaire. Non, il est en même temps exécutif et législatif. Les membres de la commune et les fonctionnaires de la commune reçoivent un salaire ouvrier, pas plus. En abolissant les deux dépenses les plus coûteuses de l'ancien État, l'armée et la bureaucratie, et en donnant le pouvoir au peuple, la commune devient un gouvernement à faible coût. De nombreuses tâches autrefois effectuées par des fonctionnaires sont prises en charge par les travailleurs eux-mêmes, généralement pendant leur temps libre. La commune proclame aussi la séparation de l'Église et de l'État. La commune a également un caractère international. Un Hongrois nommé Frankel devient commissaire du travail et les généraux polonais Dąbrowski et Wroblewski dirigent la défense de Paris d'une manière éclatante. La commune prend également d'importantes mesures sociales, dont les ateliers abandonnés sont transformés en coopératives sous le contrôle des travailleurs. Le salaire minimum est établi. L'éducation est gratuite en accordant une grande attention à l'éducation des filles. une pension est accordée aux veuves et orphelins victimes de la guerre. Des banques alimentaires et des cantines sont mis en place pour les personnes démunies. Les jeux d'hasard et la prostitution sont interdits. La guillotine est brûlée le 6 avril. Mais la commune ne réussit pas à exproprier la Banque de France qui continue à financer le gouvernement de tiers. La commune ne parvient pas à disperser le gouvernement bourgeois à Versailles. C'était pourtant la condition pour la victoire de la Révolution dans toute la France. Dès le mois d'avril, le gouvernement de Thiers prépare la contre-attaque avec l'aide des Allemands. Ces derniers libèrent 100 000 prisonniers pour renforcer l'armée du gouvernement. Paris est de nouveau encerclé, au nord par les Allemands, au sud par les troupes gouvernementales. Le 21 mai, les troupes réussissent à pénétrer dans Paris. Pendant la semaine sanglante qui suivra, Paris est reconquis par le pouvoir bourgeois. La répression et la lutte est terrible. 30 000 Parisiens, dont des femmes et des enfants, perdent la vie au cours des combats et pendant la répression. Quelques 45 000 Parisiens sont condamnés, dont une partie sont déportés en Nouvelle-Calédonie. 100 000 Parisiens vont fuir, entre autres vers Londres, où ils seront accueillis par l'Internationale, par Marx et les filles de Marx. Cette terrible défaite était un grand traumatisme pour le mouvement ouvrier à cette époque, et elle a divisé profondément l'Internationale. Mais pour les communistes d'aujourd'hui, eux, ils peuvent s'appuyer non seulement sur l'expérience de la Commune, mais aussi sur l'expérience du pouvoir soviétique. C'est un avantage énorme. Vive la Commune, vive l'Internationale. Merci pour votre attention.
Thank you, Franz, for that introduction to the for that intro to the Paris Commune. Just to remind any of our viewers that have just joined in on Zoom or Facebook, this is the first in a series of ILPS events commemorating 150-year anniversary of the Paris Commune. We have language interpretation in French, Spanish, and Bahasa available if you're with us on Zoom, which you can select at the bottom of the Zoom screen in the interpretation menu. And if you have questions that come to mind during the presentations, please put them in the Q&A box on Zoom or in the comment section if you're with us on the Facebook live stream. Now we move on to our keynote speaker, Professor Jose Maria Sison, popularly known as Ka Joma or Comrade Joma. He is often described as a prolific author of political writings, speeches, and interviews. He is a well-known poet, literary critic, and a perennial student of history. If there is anything Professor Sison would like to be known for, it would be as a relentless fighter for the independence, justice, and democracy of his country and people. He is a firm believer that socialism and ultimately communism are what will free the world's people from ruling systems that are inhuman, unjust, oppressive, and exploitative. He is an internationalist, a thinker, and militant in the service of a working class unity and the anti-imperialist solidarity of all peoples. Without further ado, welcome Professor Jose Maria Sison, Chairperson Emeritus of the ILPS. The floor is yours.
Dear comrades and friends, I thank the International League of People's Struggle for inviting me to give the keynote speech in this webinar for the purpose of celebrating the Paris Commune of 1871 on the occasion of its 150th anniversary. I am honored and delighted to discuss the significance of this great and glorious revolutionary event and its relevance to the world proletarian revolution up to the ongoing anti-imperialist and democratic struggles of the proletariat and the entire people of the world. I am proud that since the founding in 2001, the ILPS has been inspired by the Paris Commune and has contributed greatly to the worldwide anti-imperialist and democratic mass movement. Again, in the revolutionary spirit of the Paris Commune of 1871, I dare say that these current mass struggles are in transition to the great resurgence of the world proletarian revolution from the major setbacks caused by revisionist betrayal of the socialist cause. The proletariat and people can never accept the escalation of their exploitation and oppression. Imperialism has inflicted neoliberalism, state terrorism, wars of aggression, the threat of nuclear annihilation, global warming, and pandemics on the proletariat and the people of the world, and has incited them to fight back and advance the revolutionary cause of national liberation, democracy, and socialism. As chairman of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Philippines, I discussed the significance of the Paris Commune of 1871 on the occasion of its 100th anniversary in 1971. I relied on the best possible summing up and analysis of the great event, the Civil War in France, by Karl Marx, who monitored the event through various public sources of information and best of all through members of the International Working Men's Association, the first international, who were the Central Committee leading the Paris Commune. The Paris Commune proved for the first time in the history of mankind that the working class was capable of destroying the bourgeois state machinery as well as replacing it with the state of the working class, a dictatorship over the exploiting classes, and a democracy for the erstwhile exploited classes. From March 18 to May 28, 1871, the workers of Paris, who numbered in the hundreds of thousands and who constituted the National Guards, rebelled, dismantled the reactionary army, and demonstrated that they could seize political power and govern a new society. They resisted the attempts of the French bourgeois reactionaries headed by Thiers to disarm them in compliance with the terms of surrender to the Prussians led by Bismarck, who won in the Franco-Prussian War. Upholding the dictatorship of the proletariat, the communards issued as their first decree the suppression of the standing army of the bourgeoisie and its replacement by the armed people. The Paris Commune was eventually defeated because it failed to launch promptly an offensive against the reactionary bourgeois government put up by Thiers in Versailles at the time that its army was still weak and disorganized, and the Prussians had not yet released the many French army men that they had held as prisoners of war to favor the French bourgeois government. To gain time on the communards and make a deal with Bismarck, Thiers dispatched armed detachments against Paris and at the same time pretended to sue for peace negotiations upon the failure of every armed expedition. Thus, Thiers and Bismarck were eventually able to launch attacks that overpowered the Paris Commune and resulted in the mass murder of 20,000 to 30,000 worker martyrs. Marx honored the Paris Commune in the following terms: "Working men's Paris, with its commune, will be forever celebrated as the glorious harbinger of a new society. Its exterminator's history has been already nailed to that eternal pillory from which all the prayers of their priests will not avail to redeem them." The Paris Commune raised to a new and higher level the glorious struggle of the working class that burst out all over Europe in 1848. Consequent to the Paris Commune, Marx and Engels inscribed in the 1872 preface to the Communist Manifesto the following fundamental lesson of decisive importance. One thing especially proved by the Commune, namely that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. they saw fit to restate the words that are in the single quotation marks from the Civil War in France. To lead the October Revolution of 1917 to victory, Lenin learned well from the Paris Commune and repudiated the bourgeois parliamentarist, social chauvinist, and social pacifist of the Second International. In his State and Revolution, he was emphatic on the lesson from the Paris Commune that the proletariat must smash the bureaucratic military machinery of the bourgeoisie. Thus, the October Revolution of the Bolsheviks was essentially the destruction of the bourgeois state machine, establishment of the proletarian dictatorship, and eventually its consolidation under Stalin. In consonance with the Paris Commune, Chairman Mao taught us, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. This is the essence not only of the People's Democratic Revolution under the leadership of the proletariat in China, but also of all revolutionary struggles waged by the proletariat in the 150 years after the Paris Commune. It is impossible for the proletariat to seize political power without following and realizing the principle of armed revolution. One more fundamental lesson that the Paris Commune has taught us is that the proletariat must have its revolutionary party to lead the revolution and overthrow the bourgeoisie, and for such party to start to build its strength ideologically, politically, and organizationally for the purpose. The revolutionary practice of the Paris Commune showed the need for a central body of leadership to guide the vigorous movement of the revolutionary masses. The National Guard, the body of armed workers that seized power in Paris from the bourgeoisie, looked up to a central committee for leadership. On March 26, the Paris Commune was elected by the workers as a representative body to lead them. Though the International Working Men's Association was denounced by the bourgeoisie as responsible for leading the revolt of the workers, it did not carry the preponderant influence among the workers. Despite the fact that Marx was the leading organizer and spirit of the First International, Marxism had not yet been grasped by the majority of the workers. Blanquism and Proudhonism were acknowledged by the leaders of the Paris Commune as their guide. In practice, however, the Paris Commune debunked the Blanquist school of anarchy and the Proudhonist school of petty bourgeois socialism and proved the correctness of Marxism. Contrary to the anarchist tenets of Blanqui, the workers of Paris did not only destroy the bourgeois state machine, but established the dictatorship of the proletariat, and it was not a mere bunch of intellectuals that made revolutionary triumph possible, but the great mass of workers in the course of class struggle. The economic decrees of the Paris Commune found no use for Proudhon's economic teachings about small cooperatives and had to deal with the facts of large-scale industry. Learning from the experience of the Paris Commune, Lenin wrote What is to be done in answer to the need for building the revolutionary party of the proletariat. Tirelessly, he built the Bolshevik Party as the advanced detachment of the working class, with Marxism as the guide to action. This party served as a political leader and general staff of the proletariat in the revolution for establishing the dictatorship of the proletariat and building socialism. In the Chinese Revolution, Comrade Mao Zedong built a well-disciplined party, armed with the theory of Marxism-Leninism, using the method of criticism and self-criticism, and closely linked with the broad masses of the people. This was the core of leadership of the entire Chinese proletariat and the people. It was the leader of the People's Army and of the United Front of all revolutionary classes and organizations. Still, one more fundamental lesson that can be learned from the Paris Commune is that the creators of history are the masses.
Just one moment, please. Can the Spanish interpreter please make sure that they are on the Spanish channel and not the English channel?
Can you ask him to mute also?
Also, mute your sound, please, so you do not hear the original sound. Do make sure you are not hearing the original sound. Sorry for all of our people on the call. We will now continue with the speech by Joma.
Leaders can sum up and analyze experience and formulate new tasks only on the basis of the revolutionary mass movement. Genuine leadership can arise, make decisions, and act correctly only by relying on the masses and learning from the masses. From the masses to the masses is a correct line that must be followed by the Revolutionary Party of the Proletariat and by its cadres. At first, Marx warned the Paris workers that any attempt to overthrow the government would be the folly of despair. But when in March 1871, the revolutionary workers of Paris revolted against the bourgeoisie and created the Commune, Marx set the example of a true revolutionary thinker and leader by welcoming the Paris Commune and considering himself a participant. He paid tribute to the revolutionary enthusiasm and initiative of the workers and closely studied their movement for its great worth. The Paris Commune showed the boundless capacity of the revolutionary masses for creating new things after destroying the bourgeois state machine with their own armed power. They created a new government based on a truly democratic exercise of universal suffrage among the workers. They put up a leadership from their own ranks, working conscientiously and receiving pay equal to that of the worker, with no representation allowances and discretionary funds. Such a leadership shunned the separation of executive and legislative functions. It was the complete opposite of the parliament, a talking shop of the bourgeoisie and the landlord class, and a complete obstacle to social revolution. Any leader was subject to recall by the people. The Paris Commune had the attributes of a true democracy for the proletariat and the people, while being at the same time a class dictatorship over the exploiting classes. The workers of Paris were incapable of achieving so much, despite the hardship and difficulties of political and economic life in a country defeated in war, in a city besieged not only by the ruffians of Thiers, but also by the troops of Bismarck. How much more would the workers have accomplished had they had their own class-conscious party, thoroughly instructed on Marxism? How much more would they have been capable of had they not been prevented from a revolutionary coordination with the workers in other cities and with the peasant masses in the provinces of France? The Paris Commune envisioned a nationwide system of people's communes with the national delegation seated in Paris. Subsequent to the defeat of the Paris Commune of 1871, especially because of the mass murders inflicted on the workers during the bloody week of March 21 to 28, the international bourgeoisie and its articulators prognosticated that the working class would not dare to rebel again against the bourgeois state. But the heroism and martyrdom of the workers of Paris inspired the workers of so many countries to build socialist and labor parties and movements. The Internationale became their common anthem. In its better years, within the period from 1898 to 1916, the Second International contributed to the building of Marxist parties of workers and making Marxism the main trend in the working class movement in Europe in the last decade of the 19th century, despite the revisionism of Bernstein and then Kautsky. In the meantime, as a consequence of repeated crises of overproduction and the relentless accumulation and concentration of private capital, several capitalist countries became monopoly capitalist and ushered in the world era of modern imperialism and the world proletarian revolution towards the end of the 19th century. In this new era, the world capitalist system became more afflicted by the contradiction between the social character of the forces of production, the proletariat and the means of modern industry, and the private mode of appropriation by the capitalist class, and became even more prone to the crisis of overproduction, intensified class struggle, and inter-imperialist wars, such as those of World War I and World War II in the first half of the 20th century. World War I provided the conditions for the working class to seize political power in Russia and build Soviet socialism in 1/6 of the earth, where Tsarism once reigned. World War II provided the conditions for communist parties to defeat the forces of fascism and take power and build socialism in China and other countries, as well as to lead the national liberation movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. By the early 1950s, 1/3 of humankind was governed by communist and workers' parties. But the US emerged as the strongest imperialist power, also as a result of World War II. It launched the Cold War since 1947 and unleashed propaganda campaigns of anti-communism, touting free enterprise as a guarantee to democracy. It violently opposed the people's movements for national liberation, democracy, and socialism. It waged wars of aggression in Korea from 1950 to 1953, and in Vietnam and the rest of Indochina from 1955 onward. The Korean people and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea fought and stalemated US imperialism, and the Vietnamese and the rest of the Indochinese people inflicted on the US its first categorical defeat in 1975. All the while, China was engaged in socialist revolution and construction and stood as a bulwark against US imperialism. From its relative peak of economic and military strength from 1945 to 1975, the US started its strategic decline due to stagflation, military overspending, and the economic recovery of capitalist countries devastated during World War II. But in the Soviet Union, where Stalin had directed the post-war reconstruction of the socialist economy and had broken the nuclear monopoly of the US, modern revisionism had risen to power and totally negated Stalin in 1956 in order to overthrow the state of the working class and allow the bourgeoisie and the factors of capitalism to grow within socialist society. It pushed bourgeois reformism and pacifism under Khrushchev and then social imperialism under Brezhnev. The Communist Party of China opposed the modern revisionist line of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in the international communist and workers' movement. It also opposed within China the blatant rightists as well as the homegrown and Soviet-influenced revisionists. It prevailed over a number of anti-socialist elements before, during, and after the Great Leap Forward, but some persisted in power. Recognizing the crucial importance of upholding Marxist-Leninist theory and practice, Mao carried out the socialist education movement from 1962 to 1966 to cleanse the party and the socialist state of rightism and revisionism ideologically, politically, economically, and organizationally. But this did not suffice, and thus the great proletarian cultural revolution was carried out from 1966 to 1976 on the theory and practice of continuing revolution under proletarian dictatorship through cultural revolution in order to combat revisionism, prevent capitalist restoration, and consolidate socialism. At the 100th anniversary of the Paris Commune in 1971, the GPCR shone brilliantly as the peak of the world proletarian revolution, but it would go through twists and turns and ups and downs. The rightists or revisionists increasingly succeeded to combine with the centrists against the left behind the apparent victory of the GPCR while Mao was still alive. But soon after his death in 1976, the capitalist rulers led by Deng Xiaoping successfully carried out a counter-revolutionary coup against the proletarian revolutionaries and the socialist state of the working class. The Denguese counter-revolution declared the GPCR as a complete catastrophe and carried out the restoration of capitalism in China through capitalist reforms and opening up to the US and world capitalist system. After suppressing the mass movements against inflation and corruption at Tiananmen in Beijing and in scores of other cities in China in 1989, Deng and his political stooges pleaded for more economic concessions from the US and became even more determined to strengthen capitalism in China as an integral part of the world capitalist system. By 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and its satellite revisionist-ruled states in Eastern Europe disintegrated. The bourgeoisie took full control of all the countries in the Soviet bloc. The Communist parties influenced by Soviet modern revisionism all disintegrated. So did those communist parties which became confused by the anti-GPCR position of the Chinese party and state. US imperialism emerged as winner of the Cold War and became the sole superpower. And its ideologues and publicists proclaimed the death of socialism and the end of history with the supposed permanence of capitalism and liberal democracy. US imperialism gloated over the full restoration of capitalism in China, Russia, and the entire former Soviet bloc. It was unmindful of the fact that China and Russia were two large capitalist countries that could exacerbate inter-imperialist contradictions and worsen the crisis of the world capitalist system. It became preoccupied with the objective of subordinating China to US economic expansion under the neoliberal policy of imperialist globalization and subjecting Russia to the neoconservative policy of using the full spectrum of US power to expand NATO and undo the vestiges of Soviet power and influence in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Middle East. Thus, the US itself aggravated the conditions for accelerating its own strategic decline through its economic, trade, and technological concessions that enabled China to grow economically and militarily and undermine US economic hegemony, and through the endless wars to counter Russia that cost $6 trillion in so short a period of time. The US has conspicuously lost its sole superpower status since the financial meltdown of 2008 and the ceaseless worsening of the economic and political crisis of the world capitalist system until now. US imperialism adopted neoliberalism to overcome the problem of stagflation, but it never solved the crisis of overproduction, which had been the root cause of stagflation. The increased production by the military-industrial complex was profitable within the US economy and from sales of war material to the oil-producing countries, but it was counterproductive and unprofitable as the US wars of aggression failed to expand a stable economic territory for US imperialism abroad. We see today the growing turbulence in the world capitalist system. All major contradictions in the world capitalist system are intensifying, such as those between labor and capital, those between the imperialist powers and the oppressed peoples and nations, those between the imperialist powers and states that assert national independence and the socialist cause, and those among the imperialist powers themselves. The intensification of contradictions between labor and capital within the traditional and relatively new imperialist countries is due to the worsening crisis of overproduction relative to the drastically reduced income of the working people in the entire world capitalist system. The workers have become restless and rebellious due to unemployment, low income, rising prices of basic commodities, austerity measures, the curtailment of their democratic rights, and the rise of chauvinism, racism, and fascism. Among the imperialist powers, the US and China have emerged as the two main contenders in the struggle for a redivision of the world. Each tries to have its own alliance with other imperialist powers. The traditional alliance of the US, Europe, and Japan is still operative in such multilateral agencies as the IMF, World Bank, and WTO, and in NATO and other military alliances. Reigns against the traditional imperialist powers are China and Russia, which have broadened their alliance in BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS Development Bank, the Belt and Road Initiative, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Fund. The imperialist powers engage in a struggle for a redivision of the world, but so far they have not directly warred on each other to acquire or expand their sources of cheap labor and raw materials, markets, fields of investment, and spheres of influence. They have developed the neo-colonial ways and means of shifting the burden of crisis to the underdeveloped countries. They are afraid of any direct war between imperialist powers because they're afraid of mutual destruction with their own nuclear weapons of mass destruction. They give vent to their aggressiveness by waging wars against underdeveloped countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. They make the oppressed peoples and nations of the underdeveloped countries the main source of super profits through a higher rate of exploitation. They make them suffer the main brunt of the recurrent and worsening economic and financial crisis of the world capitalist system. Even as they are now increasingly protectionist, they continue the policy of neoliberal globalization at the expense of others. To suppress the people's resistance to oppression and exploitation, they provide their client states with the means of state terrorism and fascist rule by the bureaucratic comprador bourgeoisie. They also use their respective client states for proxy wars and counter-revolutionary wars, for maintaining their economic territory or for redividing the world. Despite their attempts to shift the burden of crisis to the oppressed peoples and nations, the imperialist powers are driven to extract higher profits from their own working class under the neoliberal policy regime, to suppress the resistance of the proletariat and people to oppression and exploitation in both the developed and underdeveloped countries. They have enacted so-called anti-terrorist laws and are increasingly prone to the use of state terrorism and to sponsor fascist organizations and movements for countering the growing revolutionary movement of the proletariat. There are anti-imperialist governments like the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Cuba, Vietnam, Venezuela, and Syria that effectively assert national independence and the socialist cause. They enjoy the support of the people, stand up against US imperialism, and take advantage of the contradictions among the imperialist powers in order to counter sanctions, military blockade, and aggression. The people and revolutionary forces led by the proletariat can strengthen themselves in the course of their just struggles. Since 2019, we have seen the unprecedented rise and spread of gigantic anti-imperialist and democratic mass protests joined by millions of people and occurring in all the 6 continents and in both the developed and underdeveloped countries. These are the resistance of the broad masses of the people to the extreme exploitativeness and bankruptcy of the neoliberal policy of imperialist globalization and to the escalation of state terrorism and wars of aggression. I'm deeply gratified that the International League of People's Struggle has contributed greatly to the development of the anti-imperialist and democratic mass movement since 2001. The mass protests of 2019 flowed from earlier ones as a result of the persistent stagnation and depression of the world capitalist economy and outrageous failure of the leaders and experts of the imperialist powers and the taskmasters of the client states to solve the economic crisis and avert political crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdowns and other efforts of the authorities to discourage the mass protest failed to diminish and dampen these in 2020. Instead, the pandemic has served to expose the extreme antisocial character and consequences of neoliberalism and rouse the broad masses of the people to rise up against the loss of jobs and incomes, deprivation of social services, the bailouts and stimulus packages for the big bourgeoisie, the escalation of repressive measures, and the promotion of fascism in the name of anti-terrorism. It is expected that the mass protests will intensify and spread further in 2021 and thereafter. Clearly, the world capitalist system and the domestic ruling systems are in a grave and deep-going crisis. The imperialist powers and their puppet states fail more than ever in the old way. The worldwide anti-imperialist and democratic mass struggles signify the transition to the resurgence of the world proletarian revolution. The revolutionary spirit of the Paris Commune of 1871 is once more calling for the further rise of the oppressed and exploited masses and the revolutionary parties of the proletariat against imperialism and all reactionary classes. The massive and sustained mass protest in various countries of Europe, North America, Oceania, Latin America, Asia, and Africa bring to the surface the deep-seated detestation of the people for the extreme oppression and exploitation that they are suffering. The proletariat and people of the world are fighting back. The starting points or inciting moments for the mass protest have been concrete issues of wide variability, but they always rise up to the level of condemning imperialism and all reaction and demanding revolutionary change of system. The upsurge of anti-imperialist and democratic mass struggle shows that we are definitely in transition to the resurgence of the world proletarian revolution. The broad masses of the people are rising up against the worst forms of imperialist oppression and exploitation, such as neoliberalism, austerity measures, gender discrimination, racism, oppression of indigenous peoples, fascism, wars of aggression, and environmental destruction. The wanton plunder of the natural resources by monopoly capitalism threatens the very life of humankind with global warming and pandemics, even as the danger of nuclear annihilation persists, especially because the imperialist powers are whipping up fascism. In the last 50 years, we have seen how imperialism, neocolonialism, modern revisionism, neoliberalism, fascism, and neoconservatism attack and put down the proletariat and people of the world. Now the people are resisting as never before and generating new revolutionary forces, including parties of the proletariat and mass organizations that are guided by Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. These will ultimately result in the spread of armed revolutionary movements and the rise of socialist states and people's democracies with a socialist perspective. While the imperialist powers and their reactionary stooges all over the world are using all kinds of counter-revolutionary violence to suppress the mass protests, there are the reformists and opportunists who claim that these are leaderless and spontaneous and would soon subside upon the peaceful democratization of the rotten ruling systems of the exploiting classes. But already there are Marxist-Leninist Maoist parties and groups striving to develop themselves as revolutionary parties of the proletariat and to build the armed revolutionary organization for seizing political power under the inspiration of the Paris Commune of 1871 and succeeding armed revolutions. The Filipino people and the revolutionary forces have persevered in the new democratic revolution through protracted people's war and with a socialist perspective in the last more than 50 years. Thus, they are now in the front line of the ongoing anti-imperialist and democratic mass struggles, and they are making major contributions in the transition to the resurgence of the world proletarian revolution. Ever loyal to the just revolutionary cause of the proletariat and people, they have waged revolutionary struggle resolutely and militantly and have fought fiercely against the counter-revolutionary campaigns of suppression by the enemy. They have been inspired by the revolutionary spirit of the Paris Commune of 1871 and by all succeeding struggles for national liberation and socialism in the world, and are more than ever determined to contribute to the resurgence of the world proletarian revolution. They take pride in being referred to as one of the torchbearers of the anti-imperialist struggles of the peoples of the world and the world proletarian revolution. Their revolutionary will and fighting spirit are more than ever higher, as their revolutionary struggles are now in concert with the resurgent mass struggles of the proletariat and people on a global scale. We foresee that in the next 50 years, the crisis-stricken world capitalist system will continue to break down and give way to the rise of anti-imperialist, democratic, and socialist states and societies. Thank you.
Thank you for that very much, Professor Sison, for that reflection on the impact of the Paris Commune on the trajectory of people's movements to this day, and some of the lessons drawn 150 years since the Paris Commune, as well as a thorough situationer of the last few decades of crisis of the world capitalist imperialist system, the mass protest movements that are rising on every continent across the globe in response to the ever worsening conditions, with a very hopeful message that we will win. And we also thank our attendees and viewers for your patience while we addressed our tech issues. Professor Sison's speech will also be published on the ILPS website in full, so you'll be able to read up on anything that you missed during our interruptions. And again, please leave your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom menu, or you can drop them in the comments if you're with us on the Facebook live stream. Now we're going to go on to our panel of reactors, and our first reactor is Azra Saeed from the International Women's Alliance. She also runs Roots for Equity, a Karachi-based organization that works with small and landless peasants. She is the current vice chairperson of the ILPS. So Azra, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. Thank you so much. I would really, first of all, like to thank ILPS for giving me the honor of speaking at this event, where we are commemorating the 150 years of the Paris Commune. The Paris Commune will remain a beacon for the struggling people of the world forever. And it is, for me, an immensely humbling and a great honor to be here. Professor Sison has already highlighted one of the greatest milestones of people's history, and that is, of course, the Paris Commune. So I will not dwell on it anymore and would like to instead focus on what is ahead of us and what can we learn from the 72 days of the first proletariat state. As Professor Sison just said, we are now at a new height of imperialist capitalism. With the end of the Cold War, the vicious attack launched by the US monopoly capitalist has pushed the people of the world into extremely dire states of impoverishment, hunger, loss of dignity, and generally being thrown from pillar to post. And in this last decade, the US is now joined by a second imperialist force of China. And we are now seeing new political formations, and those are still unfolding. In all of this continued rush of the imperialists and their client states, we see that they are arming themselves with the most destructive weapons, ranging from the chemical weapons to biological weapons to the atomic weapons. It is in this scenario that the world has actually been facing an acute economic downturn. There has been a recession which has been going on for many years. And now in the last year, the COVID-19 pandemic has pushed us much, much deeper into an economic depression. There is severe unemployment, there is low production, and we are seeing lessening of FDI. The lashings of the reactionary forces over the last decade, especially after the Cold War, has resulted in a whole range of rainbow movements across the world. whether they be in the imperialist countries themselves or in the semi-colonial countries, the so-called developing world. The crux of the matter is that there is now widespread discontent among the people. There are particular movements that are now playing out that include the women's movement, the environmental movement, and with the recent happening in the US, the anti-race movement has also escalated. Of course, the workers and the peasants across the world are coming to the fore more and more. There is no doubt that much of their unrest is hidden and brushed aside by the corporate media, only allowing us access to what is actually happening on the ground through the media communication systems of our movements themselves. The failure of the capitalist system is now very, very vivid to everybody. The system has now failed for decades to provide decent livelihood, and now this is aiding the movements to escalate. Of course, the discontent which Professor Sison talked about has only helped us in ensuring that the people collect together to raise their voices. So given the above, there is ample revolutionary material and blood for us to envision a tidal wave of revolutionary struggles that will, and of course, that will smash capitalism, smash all reactionary forces. Our task now is to learn from the Paris Commune and to sit and really work through what needs to be done in the coming decades so that many of the debacles, many of the problems that the workers had the courage to, it was a very much a spontaneous, they were thrown into a situation where there was nothing but to take the state over. We are now it is quite clear that it is going to happen again, that the capitalist system will result in total failure and chaos. And it is for the revolutionaries, it is for the proletariat to come forward and take on the world as ours. It is the workers' right, it is the proletariat's right to ensure that the world, the state of the world are in the hands of the workers and the peasants, of the masses. But that really needs critical thinking, that really needs to figure out what will be the challenges that are already there on the ground. They need to be studied, methodologies and strategies need to be developed so that the proletariat can lead us to ultimate and lasting victory. I will highlight some of the challenges that as a woman working in Pakistan and working with the realm of movements across the world, the challenges that are coming to the fore. And that, in my opinion, are critical. So number one, that the imperialist powers are using a very real enemy of the proletariat, which is patriarchy, as a shield. Instead of highlighting the exploitative, oppressive forces of capitalism and feudalism as the real enemies of the women, workers, and peasants, the enemy is being portrayed as men. The violence against women, which is indeed very real and extremely oppressive, is being highlighted. And the intent is, of course, to veer away our attention from class-based exploitation and create a divide among the proletariats, among the men and the women. It is critical that we study this and find ways to debunk the ideas that it is actually patriarchy which is the real enemy and not the dominant class paradigm, not the reactionary forces. This is going to be a real challenge because every state apparatus across the imperialist countries is being used to talk about women's liberation as they did in Afghanistan. And today we know that they're again sitting on the table with the Taliban, trying to figure out how to bring back peace, where Biden has just recently said that May 1st, the American forces cannot be brought back. And we all know that they will never let go of these areas that they are occupying right now, but all in the name of women. So I think that's one which I really would like to highlight. Second, being part of Asia, the biggest, most populous continent in the world, I would like to highlight one thing more. Our continent the imperialist forces are vying across our lands, but not only our lands, but our seas and oceans, trying to have supreme control over the seafaring routes the backbone of imperialist trade. So Asia now is very critical, and that has been said by the Americans over and over again in the past 2 to 3 years especially. They will use all means to create divide among the people in this region, in Asia. And some of the biggest divides that we see now is religion. The latest on the table now are the Muslims being jutted against each other. The Shiite Muslims and the Sunni Muslims is an old method that has been used to divide MENA region, the Middle East, North Africa region, between Palestine and Iran, and of course the criminal states of Saudi Arabia and its whole range of satellites which are revolving around the United States. And of course, in the past years, the Rohingya and now the Chinese Muslims. All this revolves around trying to create a scenario of religion as a basic divide. And they will really, really they will unleash God knows what kinds of brutality in the coming years. And they have already created basic fodder for that. Some of the most terrible, vicious fundamentalist groups have already been created in Asia, whether it is in India or it is in Pakistan or it is in Afghanistan, and now of course in Turkey. And this has been done by the US and the ruling elites of our countries. These state-supported groups have a growing popular right-wing following and pose a considerable barrier to class-based political organizing. So this is the second challenge. I think it needs to be addressed now. We need to counter these two major strains that you can see that the imperialists are using to divide the class-based fight that is going to be on hand. Along with religion, there is an underlying thread in Asia and very blatantly in the imperialist relations now, especially after what's happened in the US and of course in Europe, and that is of racism. That I will not address anymore. These two, race and religion, are overlapping, are being used consistently, and in Asia, especially in the subcontinent, race has been an issue of hundreds and hundreds of years of divide, which the Britishers fostered very, very cleverly. And it is an intrinsic part of the divide of the subcontinent. And of course, in other parts of the Asian continent, whether it is Indonesia, whether it is, now you see it also happening within Hong Kong. So this is something which we'll really need to talk about and think through. How do we counter this? Finally, the last I want to really point out is the information technology and the artificial intelligence technology. These are a new mix to the old phenomena of divide. On one hand, this technology has eased our work, has allowed us access to fresh and new grounds for our political work. But at the same time, it is also creating a fresh challenge as it is now breaking up collective workspaces. The biggest danger is, of course, to our youth. For some, it provides glamorous ease of work portals that allow them fairly comfortable workspaces and comfortable living. But for a very large majority of youth and young people, this technology has created low-paid service sector work. The workspace is fragmented, it is isolated, and also it is very difficult to organize. And lastly, I will say that the biggest challenge is to turn all the movements under the umbrella of class struggle. I have just said we have many movements there, whether it is the environment movement, the women's movement, and so on. But the umbrella that we need, that the anchor that we need to ensure that we do not fall into another trap is to make this a class-based struggle. We make sure that the masses, the peasants, and the workers are the bulk work of this movement. And of course, the key lies in intensifying our political education, especially for the key sectors of young people and the youth, women and girls, and of course, for our workers and the peasants. A very critical aspect of organizing these sectors need to take into account the divisions that I have highlighted above. There has to be a greater unity between theory and practice, and clearer theoretical perspectives really reap multitude benefits, especially when the state persecution intensifies. The way that a movement can go forward and can handle the backlash of the state is really only based on our theoretical clarity that allows us to withstand every kind of persecution, brutality, murder that the state and its reactionary forces unleashes on the masses. And so a strong political core in the masses are absolutely critical for the coming years. There has to be methodology and strategy for organizing, creating unity within and among the stratified classes is another key area of the intervention. We know that the mass base, of course, lies with the proletariat, with the peasants, but there is a whole range of other classes which can actually turn revisionist and can become opportunist at the drop of a hat. They don't need anything to walk out and sell our souls to the imperialists. So we need to really think through how are we going to do this kind of unity work, this kind of political work, so that strong alliances can be built locally, nationally, regionally, and internationally. Recognition of the revisionist streams of deliberate imperialist infringements, the plotting and destruction of our movements, our unities are areas which need keen attention for building a strong proletarian surge to overcome reactionary forces. Finally, building party-based configurations are absolutely necessary for ensuring discipline and unity. Otherwise, we keep on maintaining these movements which petter and die away, which are sometimes very deliberately co-opted. And because there is no theoretical clarity, the movements are not allowed to go further in creating a class struggle. The challenges have to be taken up through our creativity in delivering political education, our wholehearted, not only commitment, but utmost unflinching belief that we will win the struggle, no matter how hard, how harsh, and how long it may be, how vicious the reactionaries may be, no matter what, how many are thrown into jails or tortured or killed, as it is happening across the world in many of the countries, not to mention Philippines, of course. But there is only one way ahead. There can be no turning back. This is the biggest inspiration that the Paris Commune has given us, and that is keeping our struggles and our revolutions alive. Friends, I thank you once again for giving me this space. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Azra, for that very important intervention, highlighting the different movements and struggles that are being waged across different sectors, and emphasizing the importance of unity and alliances between the forces of the revolution on the basis of class, as well as developing clear lines between theory and practice, so that we may go forward in the struggle, prepared for all that the reactionary forces can respond with. And a very important message at the end of how we need our strong convictions in the struggle at every step of the way. We will go on to our second reactor now, and we're going all the way from Pakistan across to the US to Frank, where we're going to hear from Frank Chapman, who is the Executive Director of the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, which was refounded in 2019 by Frank along with Angela Davis. Frank has published 2 books. The first, The Damned Don't Cry, Pages from the Life of a Former Prisoner and Organizer, tells his story of being wrongfully convicted as a young man, then politicized in prison by the growing Black liberation movement, and his introduction to Marxism. His second book, Marxist-Leninist Perspectives on Black Liberation and Socialism, was just published by Freedom Road Socialist Organization, of which Frank is on the Central Committee. So over to you, Frank. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I thank ILPS for honoring me with an invitation to this very powerful commemoration of the Paris Commune. Comrades, in commemorating the 150th anniversary of the Paris Commune, I want to bring to your attention a quote from Frederick Engels. introduction of the 1891 edition of Marx's Civil War in France. Engels is speaking about the characteristic attribute of the bourgeois state. And I quote, "Society had created its own organs to look after its own common interests, originally through the division of labor. But these organs, at whose head was the state power, had in the course of time, in pursuance of their own special interests, transformed themselves from servants of society into the masters of society. This can be seen, for example, not only in the hereditary monarchy, but equally so in the democratic republic. Nowhere do politicians form a more separate and powerful section of the nation than precisely in North America. There, each of the two major parties, which alternately succeed each other in power, is in turn controlled by people who make a business of politics, who speculate on seats in the legislative assemblies of the Union, as well as of the separate states, or who make a living by carrying on agitation for their party, and on its victory are rewarded with positions. It is well known how the Americans have been trying for 30 years to shake off this yoke, which has become intolerable, and how in spite of it all, they continue to sink deeper and deeper into the swamp of corruption. It is precisely in America that we see best how this takes place in the process of state power making itself independent in relation to society, whose mere instrument it was originally intended to be. Here there exists no dynasty, no nobility, no standing army beyond the few men keeping watch on the Indians, no bureaucracy with permanent post or the right to pensions. And nevertheless, we find here two great gangs of political speculators who alternately take possession of the state power and exploit it by the most corrupt means and for the most corrupt ends. And the nation is powerless against these two great cartels of politicians who are ostensibly its servants, but in reality dominate and plunder it. This was written in 1981. It could have been written last week. So what do workers do against this inevitable transformation of the state and its organs from servants of society to masters? In all previous states, class oppression remains after one class overthrows another. The Commune made use of state power, as has been pointed out in those who have spoken before me. It did all posts, administrative, judicial, and education. It did fill all posts, but it did so by election on the basis of universal suffrage, with the right of recall at any time by the electorate. Then all officials, regardless of rank, were paid only by the highest wage received by other workers in order to set up a barrier against political careerism. In other words, the Commune shattered the former state power, replacing it by a truly democratic one. This process is described in detail by Karl Marx in the third section of the Civil War in France. The Commune was forced by circumstances to recognize that the working class, once it seizes power, cannot go on managing with the old state machine. Therefore, it must do away with all the old repressive machinery previously used to suppress the workers and the democratic struggles of the people. The Paris Commune was a heroic, momentous moment in history, and perhaps the most defining event of the 19th century, where workers seized power. However, there was also another most defining event in the 19th century, happening directly in the wake of slavery being abolished in the United States, occurring within the same framework of history, that is, during a transitional period when progressive capitalism is morphing into monopoly capitalism, a period in which the old colonialism from the mercantile and merchant manufacturing era is giving rise to imperialism. The rapid growth and era of conquest and expansion of capitalism is being replaced by the contraction and decay of capitalism. The Paris Commune came on the stage of history in the pre-dawn of the era of imperialism. And clearly the harbinger of the socialist revolution of the 20th century. The Civil War between the states produced a most defining event on this side of the Atlantic called radical reconstruction. The Civil War in France and the US were comparable, but of different measure in time, place, and circumstances. The Paris Commune lasted from March 18, 1871 to May 28, 1871. Black Reconstruction, where freed chattel slaves were voted into office, lasted from 1871 to 1877. On one side of the Atlantic, wage slaves, in an act of self-emancipation, seized state power, and on this side, in the wake of the Civil War, former chattel slaves win the rights of citizenship and proceed to be the harbingers of the greatest democratic advances in history for the most oppressed workers and poor white farmers in the former slave-holding states of the South. The Paris Commune ends in the bloody week of May 21 to 28, 1871. It ended in a massacre where thousands of working class children, women, and men were murdered in the streets by Adolphe Thiers' reactionary army. Black Reconstruction ended in the bloodletting massacres and lynching of Black people in 1877. And the bloodletting and lynching, and that bloodletting and lynching continues to this day. These are two powerful and related events in the history of our class and our people, and they speak to a profound historical truth. And that truth is that white workers of Europe cannot free themselves from wage slavery so long as Black and brown workers suffer from national and colonial oppression. And I would remind people that at the time that the Paris Commune was going on, there was French colonies. Senegal, 1854, 1865, Indochina, 1858, 1870, Syria, Lebanon, 1860, 1861, and Algeria was conquered in 1852. So France was already emerging as an imperialist power. The profound truth that workers in the white skin cannot be free while workers in the black skin are sold and branded constituted the revolutionary essence of Marxism in the 19th century. At the very moment the industrial workers of Europe were raising the banner of socialism. That essence was betrayed by social democrats in the latter part of the 19th century, particularly after the First International dissolved. It was restored by Lenin and the Bolsheviks during the Russian Revolution. For just a moment about the lessons Lenin draws from the Paris Commune. Lenin points out that the invasion of France by the Prussian army caused the French bourgeoisie to issue a call for national defense. The proletariat was confronted with the contradictory tasks of patriotism and socialism. In rising against the old regime, said Lenin, the proletariat undertook two tasks, one of them national and the other of a class character: the liberation of France from the German invasion and the socialist emancipation of the workers from capitalism. This union of two tasks forms a unique feature of the Commune, unquote. After the bourgeoisie formed a government of national defense, the proletariat fought under its leadership. Rising up against the old order, the workers responded to the rallying cry, "The country is in danger," while at the same time fighting for socialism. Marx warned against this, saying that the proletariat could not be misled by the false idea of patriotism at a time when European reaction was uniting the entire revolutionary movement. The workers must let the bourgeoisie bear the responsibility of national humiliation. The struggle for the emancipation of labor takes priority over national chauvinism. Marx was correct. For the bourgeoisie, after concluding a humiliating peace with the Prussian invaders, launched an attack against the Paris proletariat. We have already stated how the workers, after seizing power, made all official posts elective. However, blinded by dreams of higher justice, they did not carry out the task of expropriating the expropriators. That is, taking over the banks and seizing, also instead of taking the resolute offensive against its enemies, the workers, under the influence of the followers of Proudhon, made moral appeals to them. This indecisiveness gave the Versailles government the time it needed to prepare for a massacre of the workers. Because sometimes we miss this valuable lesson of the Paris Commune for revolutionaries, I conclude with the following quote from Lenin. Mindful of the lesson, and I'm quoting Lenin, mindful of the lessons of the Commune, it knew that the proletariat should not ignore peaceful methods of struggle. They serve its ordinary day-to-day interests. They are necessary in periods of preparation for revolution. But it must never forget that in certain conditions, the class struggle assumes the form of armed conflict and civil war. There are times when the interests of the proletariat call for ruthless extermination of its enemies in open armed clashes. This was first demonstrated by the French proletariat in the Commune and brilliantly confirmed by the Russian proletariat in the December uprising. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you for that intervention, Frank, that very insightful reaction, and drawing a picture of what was happening in the US in the very important abolition struggle at that time, and that great quote that white workers in Europe cannot free themselves from subjugation until Black and brown workers are also free, and pointing out the various places that France was colonizing in that time when imperialism was just rising. We are going to go into our questions and answers section now. So just to remind everyone once again, you can put your questions on Zoom in the Zoom Q&A box or in the Facebook comments on the live stream. So the first question is from Dirk, and I'm going to put it to our two reactors first, Azra and Frank, and then we'll move on for Joma's answer. It is: the Paris Commune fought for a legitimate and human cause, but was crushed with a lot of violence, resulting in so many killings. In Russia, the socialists took lessons after analyzing the events in Paris. They were successful, but when the Soviet Union progressed in their plan to establishing a socialist society, it led also to the killings of millions of alleged opponents under Stalin. Just to mention, this is an example of how things can go very wrong. What lessons can be learned from the Paris Commune, and the way socialism was implemented in the course of history in order to establish a socialist society with a human face in the true sense. I'm going to combine this with the question from Timothy, who also asks about the influence of the Paris Commune on Marx and Engels' political thought, or Marxism in general. So would Frank like to go first, and then we'll have some comments from Azra?
Yeah, well, on the question of violence, the enemy class, the bourgeoisie, is the principal perpetrator of violence, and that is obviously the case in the Paris Commune. The slaughter that took place was an act of vengeance on the part of the ruling class against the workers. They murdered people indiscriminately. You know, they went through the streets shooting people, sometimes because of the clothes that they had on. You know, so I don't quite understand what the question about violence here is. except that you can't leave out the class character. In the Civil War, like what they were having in the Soviet Union, and which, you know, lasted off and on all the way up to World War II. There was also class violence. Over 13 Western European countries put an embargo around the Soviet Union. That caused people to die from starvation. That caused people to, that spread diseases. People died from cholera, you know. This was imposed upon the Soviet Union by the ruling class for having the audacity to put the workers in power. So the way I look at it is that the main perpetrator of violence is our class enemy, who will not allow us to develop socialism peacefully. Was there another question that I'm missing?
We can get to that. I'll go to Azra next, and we'll get back to the. If you had any comments for that question, Azra.
Sure. Let me say that I cannot turn on my video because there's a power cut here. So let me just speak. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So the first question talks about the killings and the brutality of the Paris Commune. And there is no doubt that with 20 to 30,000 people killed, it was a very brutal suppression. But I think the learning was intense. The learning was that it is entirely possible for a proletariat state, which, you know, was up till now very theoretical. And for me and for all of us, we cannot ever waylay that learning. There were mistakes. For instance, it's been said that they did not take over the bank, and that was a key. That was one of the key mistakes that were made by the proletariat, and that has shown us that you cannot be lenient with the enemy. No, the enemy is the enemy, and you treat them as such to become humane at that point where you are putting at risk the lives of many thousands who have fought for a just system. One cannot do that. So of course, I think any revolution will take us to new learnings. There will always be something that we will learn in hindsight. But from the very time that I have entered a class-based movement, the main learning that has come across is that every revolution takes us forward, and no revolution can bring back, can take you back. It can only take you forward. So I think, yes, there were issues, and Marx himself has talked about it in detail. He has said many things in context to that. And I would say that prior to the Paris Commune, he had been saying, okay, one should not go in and take on a struggle because the proletariats, the workers were not ready. But it was very clear that once the Paris Commune was initiated, he stood with them. He did not hold the commune as socialism, but in his view, it was the basis on which to build the new society. It was a harbinger for what is to come. And of course, he did not, and nobody would have expected miracles. It was so such a critical time. Can you imagine? The entire Paris was basically surrounded not only by the Germans, but the Persians themselves, by the French themselves, and they let out the prisoners to take over the Paris Commune. So nobody thought that it would stay, but it has been an invaluable lesson in how we go forward. Thank you.
Thanks. And I'm just, Professor Sison, would you like to address this question?
Yes, I would like to answer the question from Dirk van Kampenhout about, about the successes and defeats of the proletarian revolution, I would use historical materialism as a guide, and I would like to give you the widest possible view about class society. Well, you know, slavery and feudalism, and I'll sweep them over, they existed for thousands of years, and they even extended themselves to the period when industrial capitalism had arisen, and even up to now, no? If you trace capitalism from the time that it became dominant, when the manufacturing stage of capitalism became prominent in the Italian city-states related to the Mediterranean trade, as Engels pointed out, no? Manufacturing capitalism is not even a millennium old, no? And when you consider industrial capitalism, it is a little over two centuries old, no? If you start from the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution in France and in the bigger Industrial Revolution in England, no? So the world proletarian revolution is relatively young if we consider the millennia that has that have passed since 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, when slavery first arose as a definite class society, and world proletarian revolution arose with its embryo, its prototype, in the establishment of the class dictatorship of the proletariat in Paris, no? And there would be that, but then the Paris Commune of 1871 succeeded for only about 64 days, and within the last week of those days, the bourgeoisie would engage in so much murder and mayhem to destroy that prototype of the proletarian state, no? And but then Marx, who at first thought that it was wiser to push the anti-war movement among the proletarians because he saw no chance of victory, he called it would be a folly of despair to carry out insurrections. But then the proletarian masses themselves proved that they could destroy the bourgeois state machine in Paris, and Marx bowed to the capability and creativity of the proletariat. But I don't think Marx thought that the Paris Commune would succeed all the way. Paris is just one of so many cities of France, but in that microcosm where all the classes are, the basic classes are involved, except the peasants, especially the rich peasants in the provinces, you will see the relatively new contending classes, the proletariat and bourgeoisie. They were contending intensely, and the working class was able to overpower the bourgeoisie and its state machine. Now, I would like to say something again under the umbrella of historical materialism. I'm going to say something sweeping to hasten my presentation. You know, from the victory and defeat of the Paris Commune through the bigger victories of the October Revolution and the building of Soviet socialism
I'm gonna give you mine.
up to 1956, with 1/3 of the world already governed by communist parties and workers' parties. And again, let's push forward to the present. We have seen twists and turns, ups and downs, no? But then you see what Marx and Engels pointed out in the presentation of historical materials. There is accumulation, there is a cumulative advance of history. Now, on the basis of the development of the productive forces, you see, the social character of production introduced by the bourgeoisie being compelled to create the proletariat, which would eventually turn its opponent. You will notice that the basic forces that make the social character of production would be the collective labor of the proletariat and the advance of science and technology. These two things keep on advancing, and the bourgeoisie will keep on having difficulties and seriously failing to control these. Okay, let me jump now to the present. You think that after the fall, you know, Abakian said the first wave of proletarian revolutions is over, meaning to say the Russian and Chinese revolutions and related revolutions are over. So I think that there is a valid view there. Only my critical view is that Abakian is a little bit immodest because he implies he leads the second wave, no? But it's also valid for him to say that if there was a wave that ended, no? that ended in 1991, there is a second wave actually developing, and the main factors at the base of all societies now existing is the growth of the proletariat and the rapidly rising social character of production. And the bourgeoisie, as before, in the time of Marx, it cannot manage the relationship of production with society, and so it goes into a crisis of production because it puts down at certain points and constantly tries to put down the working class, extracting the surplus, the surplus value, and then in the worst kind of application of capitalist greed, you have neoliberalism, which systematically puts down the wage level, takes away the social benefits, the social measures adopted in order to alleviate society. So you have, what I'm trying to say is that you can bet on the bourgeoisie, exploiting and oppressing the people more, and compelling the people and the rest of the proletariat to fight back. And you will see right now, you see in 1991, the US looked...
Professor,
excuse me.
We do have quite some questions. Please wrap up in a moment, and then we can get, there's a lot of great questions. So if you can wrap up your answer in the next minute, that would be great.
Wrap up your answer.
in the next minute.
Oh, yeah. So it appeared that the US was the winner of the Cold War. The big socialist societies fell. But then there's a big wave now of anti-imperialist and democratic struggles. And this is the prelude to another wave and bigger wave of the world proletarian revolution. The forces of production are much bigger now than before. The proletariat is much bigger than before, and science and technology has accelerated production to an extent unimaginable before. And communications, you know, Lenin was using only the train, and then in the 20th century, the plane was the most that they could do for communications, and of course the radio and all that. But now you have the means of communication are so powerful that the proletariat and the people can communicate easily. At first, they may be misled by the propaganda of the big bourgeoisie. The big bourgeoisie controls the means of production and communication, but ultimately the workers who create these things would use this in their own class interest against their class enemy. I'm sorry, I hope that rounds up my answer.
Thank you very much, Professor Joma, for that very extensive answer and for rounding it up. So I'm gonna ask the next question, and I think the first person I will call on is France. Now we have a question from Bray and from Elmer. I'm going to combine these two questions because they're a bit similar. So Elmer says, chattel slavery in the US was declared illegal after the Union victory in the US Civil War with the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865. However, there are still companies in the US which imposes chattel slavery at this point in time. What significance would the Paris Commune in 1871 contribute towards agitating farm workers in huge agricultural estates in various US states to unshackle them from this bondage? What important aspect of the Paris Commune could be an inspiration for organizers to be able to form workers' formal and informal organizations in these areas? And Ray asks, what should be the role of anti-imperialist and progressive trade unions today? The reason I ask is while we have many trade unions in the social movement, there are many that are conservative and reformist. And I'm going to ask if Franz can respond to this first, and then we'll go to our other panelists.
Okay, I'm not sure I understand the question. Chattel slavery.
I'm sorry, I was going to, the question is, what can trade unions, what is the role of anti-imperialist and progressive trade unions today? And attached to that, what aspect of the Paris Commune could be an inspiration for organizers to be able to form workers' formal and informal organizations in these areas? And that's more specific to the US.
Farm workers in the US.
For farm workers in the United States?
Yeah.
And Frank, you can also read those in, this is a question for Frank. Sorry, I had I said Franz.
Well, the reason why the question is so
last time it's Frank.
Yeah, well, the reason why the question is so confusing to me is because there's no comparison between farm workers in the United States today and chattel slavery. Absolutely none. Chattel slavery involved the buying and selling of human beings. What chattel, like farm animals, like cows and pigs and whatnot. That's that's how human beings were treated during chattel slavery. What the Civil War did, what the 13th Amendment did, which the person referred to here, it abolished the buying and selling of human beings. The Civil War didn't abolish all forms of slavery. It abolished the buying and selling of human beings, and this is what happened. Now, penal slavery still exists because under the convict lease system, which came about after the Civil War, a person convicted of a crime could be forced to work on a plantation for nothing, like a slave. So penal slavery continued to exist all the way up to this day. Penal slavery continues to exist in the United States, but chattel slavery was abolished. The buying and selling of human beings, off of auction blocks and stuff, that doesn't exist anymore. And it certainly doesn't exist among American farmers.
Oh, you didn't have the
Thanks.
Oh. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm having a lot of problems with my computer.
No worries.
I had to switch over to Joe's computer. So this transition is may have been a little disruptive. I apologize.
No problem. I think there's something you have to take when we're doing everything on Zoom. There's always some tech issues that will have to be dealt with.
So was there another question that you wanted me to address?
Yes, there was a question in there that was what should be the role of anti-imperialist and progressive trade unions today. The first part of the question did mention the two different types of slavery that were happening, but this one is more about today, the role of anti-imperialist and progressive trade unions. And it also mentions that the reason why they are Ray is asking this is because there are many trade unions in the movement that are conservative and reformists. Okay,
well, let me approach the question from this angle. A lot of things that wasn't done during the Paris Commune informs us about what we need to do. And what I was trying to point out was the question of international solidarity. It hadn't reached the stage that we're at now. But, that quote I did from Marx about labor in the white skin can't be free if it's branded and sold in the black skin, that also applies broadly to the national question. The workers of the advanced industrial countries, they cannot be free as long as you got colonial slaves, as long as there's colonialism. That's the position that we're taking, and we're saying that one of the great contributions that ultimately came out of the Paris Commune during the Communist International of the 1920s was that it was declared that that socialism was not just for white people. Socialism is for workers all over the world, and so we're talking about the nationally oppressed. We're talking about the industrial workers. We're talking about the colonial question. So there should be international solidarity on these questions. And progressive unions can play a lot of different roles, like what they did in the fight against apartheid in South Africa. They're what they can do right here in the United States with regard to immigrant labor, with regard to the oppression of black people and brown people. They can play progressive roles. The main progressive role should be guided by being opposed to the imperialist enslavement of people in other countries and within our own borders. That's the main role. To be against imperialism, because what that does that enslaves the laboring populations all around the world, you know. And if we want to play a progressive role, then we have to be opposed to that.
Great. Thank you, Frank. I'm going to go over to Azra as well, who would like to respond to this question on the role of progressive trade unions.
Well, I would respond to the role of reformist and very conservative trade unions. Actually, I think it's a world over phenomena, especially in Pakistan. So I will only reply from a Pakistani perspective. And in the past days, there was a hunger strike by workers, and the trade unions played a very negative role, actually, and they were very much in the pocket of the state. So our strategy has been in these years is to create associations of which are separate from trade unions, and to provide the kind of political and solidarity support through associations which are not necessarily trade unions. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work, but the whole question, and that's why I emphasized on political education. You know, the trade unions are now, in Pakistan, only less than 5% workers are registered. And nearly 100% of trade unions are pocket unions, or yellow unions as they're called. So that platform is now more and more not operative in the interest of the workers. And the workers actually recognize that very much so. They understand that they are being sold over by the trade unions. And so an alternate thinking strategy needs to go into how do we organize workers side by side. If they have to be in trade unions to barter, then to create an alternate leadership which could actually take over the pocket unions. But at the moment, since we cannot get into the factories directly, what we have been doing is to create alternate associations which work directly with the workers in providing political education as well as legal and other kinds of expertise that is needed for case-to-case basis. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Azra, for responding to that question on how you're addressing these problems of reformist and conservative trade unions. We're going to move on to our next question now, which is coming from June. And he writes, in my readings on the class composition of the Parisian masses who fought in the Commune, including Lenin's observation that France was still a mostly petty bourgeois country, I have this sense that whether you are an industrial worker, a craft worker, a domestic service, in some cases even an intellectual, you identified yourself as proletarian. Thus, in many proclamations of the Commune's Council, it often addressed the proletarians of Paris, and the bulk of the masses responded accordingly. For me, that's amazing, but also raises a question for our time. While we must, of course, practice the rigors of class analysis and social investigation to differentiate between industrial workers, service workers, artisans, and others who are essentially semi-proletarian or lower petty bourgeois, isn't it about time that in our work of arousing, organizing, and mobilizing them, we also emphasize their common class identity and class loyalty, basically the beginnings of full class consciousness as unapologetically proletarian? It is said that Blanqui, when he was arrested and asked about his occupation, he proudly told the gendarmes proletarian. So this question I'm going to ask Joma to address first. Isn't it about time that our work of arising, organizing, and mobilizing the masses emphasizes the common class identity and class loyalty of proletarian?
Oh, 71, the arrondissement of the districts of Paris were overwhelmingly proletarian, no? 500,000 could be categorized as industrial workers working for factories and large-scale manufacturing. And some 300,000 were artisanal workers, those who work for a small small shops, artisan shops. And then, so that was the overwhelming majority of the population of Paris. And the monarchists and reactionary Republicans left Paris at the time. Anyway, the number was not so great. The urban petty bourgeoisie of shopkeepers, of intelligentsia and shopkeepers, were of course a substantial number, but the workers indeed were predominant. Okay, but in the wholeness of France, you have lesser replications of Paris, in the sense that you see, or rather, you have an uneven, size of the proletariat in various cities. But in the countryside, Napoleon Bonaparte, when he made his coup, after he did it successfully, he made it a point to retain the land reform for the benefit of the rich peasants. And through the rich peasants dominating the countryside after the French Revolution, the church was able to recover its influence. Of course, the rich peasants are conservative, no? They would become the support of the reactionary type of republicanism, as well as the monarchist type of influence from the most reactionary forces. So, and that could be considered the basis of the petty bourgeois. If you consider France, if you use the adjective to cover France, you would conflate the urban petty bourgeoisie with the rich peasants. You have a sizable petty bourgeois force, no? So, and their influence is such that you can call France still a petty bourgeois country. That's why France could host, after the French Revolution, when the rich, the bourgeoisie raised the flag, the rags of the poor as their flag. After that, you will see the restoration, after the empire building of Napoleon for some years, you have the outright restoration of the monarchy. And then you have this back and forth between republicanism and monarchism. So that was the situation in France during the Paris Commune. And I would like to take up a previous question. What did Marx and Engels learn from the Paris Commune of 1871? This is related to the class character of the various the class forces at work in France. I think in terms of principle, Marx and Engels did not learn anything new from the Paris Commune, but they certainly learned something new that is real, that became real. That was the seizure of political power by the proletariat. Even only on the scale of Paris, that was a clear demonstration of how the proletariat can smash the state machinery, disband the reactionary army, and replace it with the armed power of the people. And so the confirmation of what was already prognosticated by the Communist Manifesto is something new. And there was also something new. Marx saw in the defeat of the Paris Commune a greater potential victory, which would later again be vindicated in the October Revolution. So what Marx and Engels learned for the first time is enshrined in the 1872 preface of the Communist Manifesto, which says that you cannot just transfer the state machinery to the proletariat. You have to smash it and put up your own, the proletariat must put up its own state power. So, and Lenin learned very much from that. So he elaborated on that in State and Revolution. And with the inspiration of the Paris Commune of 1871, Lenin was able to take the initiative ideologically and in practical terms, the seizure of political power by the proletariat from the bourgeoisie that had taken the reins of government ahead of in February, ahead of October. So, and that's the new things learned by Marx to Lenin from the Paris Commune. And another thing that came from the Paris Commune, even from its defeat, the martyrdom of the proletariat has served to inspire, instead of has served to inspire the people, instead of, as the bourgeois expected, the workers would become frightened. They will not try another time to try seeking power. They never feared to seize power when it would be possible. And I would like to, I don't know if I can pitch in on some other question. Anyway, let's take too much time.
Thank you, Professor. We will be wrapping up in the next 10 minutes, so we only have a few questions left, but we have noted down all of your questions and we'll send them to the panelists, so hopefully they can respond to them in their writing or in future events that we will be having to commemorate the commune. So going to the next question, this one is from Dan Borjal, and he asks, the failure of the Nepali Maoists under Prachanda to implement any significant reforms after giving up on the armed struggle and winning a majority in parliament, which enabled them to form a government with Prachanda as prime minister, is an example of the lesson Marx drew from the Paris Commune, that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and use it for its own purposes. The reactionary army was still intact, and Prime Minister Prachanda could not even fire the army chief. What can you say about this in connection with the peace negotiations? And that is to Professor Chom.
Could you restate the question?
Can you restate the question? Because it's not written.
Yes. It is, I will send it to you as well. I will repeat it, that the failure of the Nepali Maoists under Prachanda to implement any significant reforms after giving up the armed struggle and winning a majority in parliament enabled them to form a government with Prachanda as prime minister is an example of the lesson that Marx drew from the Paris Commune, that the working class cannot simply lay hold to the ready-made state machinery and use it for its own purposes.
Oh, yeah.
Of course.
So it's about the connection, it's about the peace negotiations. I'm sending it to you now so you can read it as well.
Well, I can say something in general about the Nepali revolution. There's been some twists and turns, no? Once upon a time, when Prachanda was leading the 10-year-long people's struggle, he was, and then the armed, and then the army garrisons in the main city would be smashed, and so there was this notion that the Maoists and the proletariat have won, practically won, and that was how the dictators would. But then there would be the compromise, with the reactionary and the reformist forces, and later on there was satisfaction with the formal dissolution of the monarchy. And but still, the reactionary and reformist forces still existed within a Nepalese society. There would be disappointment that the gains made among the peasants in the People's War would be lost, and there would be disubordination of the Maoists to eventually, after having the rightist type of Maoist in the who would be able to entice, you would have UML eventually taking back the center stage in power. And so there have been a series of Maoist oppositions, no? And Maoist attempts to resume the armed struggle in view of what they thought was the compromise and betrayal by the Maoists, who turned to be not as they were expected to be Maoist revolutionaries. To be brief, no, Prachanda was carried away by enjoying power without minding what he had fought for the benefit of the revolutionary proletariat and the peasantry of Nepal. I can only say that in general. So you have a Maoist, a party that loses control, and it becomes opposed by other Maoist groups now. And then the latest report is that those who wanted to resume the People's War have made soundings for possible negotiations. I don't know how far they would go. I think Nepal is a story in the making, and but then the level of historical developments there is much higher in terms of revolutionary flow than in many other areas. Because in the first place, you had a Maoist party that had launched a People's War, and there are still those who wish to pursue the People's War because there have been compromises and betrayals.
Thank you, Professor, for that. And the next question I'm going to ask is initially for Joma, but also other panelists can also offer anything that they know about this. But for Professor Joma, you mentioned that Mao giving socialist education to members of the Revolutionary Party. What about the education of the members of the Paris Commune? So what political education, which is something that has been touched on by several of the panelists today, and its importance, what was the type of education that was happening for the members of the Paris Commune at the time?
This is a complex question. What can I say about peace negotiations?
No, Professor, it's about the education.
What political education for members of the Paris Commune? Political education is very important because, as I pointed out, although there were many members from the First International in the leadership of the Paris Commune, in the First International was a hodgepodge in the first place. You did not, First International itself did not include people like Marx and Engels and like-minded people. You have Bakunin, you have Proudhon, and so it was a much broader kind of body that would like to uphold the interests of the proletariat, but they had different ideas. Then, as it is now, somehow there are petty bourgeois elements that mistake their petty bourgeois ideas as proletarian. And at that time, at the time of the Paris Commune, there has to be Marx and Engels had the wisdom to be in the company of such people so that they have the opportunity to influence. But when the Paris Commune occurred, the influence of Marx was in the minority compared to the influence of Blanqui, the anarchist Blanqui, and the cooperativist, petit bourgeois, cooperativist Proudhon. So having a party that is instilled with Marxism-Leninism ideologically, and that is well educated politically and organized in a disciplined way and organized to fight, that's is one thing that is needed. I pointed out 3 lessons from the Paris Commune. First, it takes armed revolution for the proletariat to gain political power and destroy the power of the bourgeoisie. Second is there must be a Marxist-Leninist party, but this would be a later development. And then third, the masses themselves are the base of whatever correct decisions that may be taken by any leadership, be it the putative Communist Party or the leadership that existed in the Paris Commune. So Marx extracted the lesson that the masses decide what happens, and the best thing that should happen is there should be a Marxist-Leninist party that educates the masses so that a higher level of action can be reached by the masses. But then you cannot. Revolution is a mass undertaking, and so even as Marxist proletarian revolutionary leadership is necessary, it is also necessary to have the masses at the base of that revolutionary process.
Thank you very much for that. Before I go on to the last question, would any of our other panelists like to give a short response to that question about the education? Okay. Then we will go on to the last question, which came in. And this came in specifically for Frank, but I think we can also apply it to different movements in different localities based on where you are. So if any of the other panelists would like to add something to it, then please go after Frank. So this is specifically asking about the lessons that movements like the Black Panthers gleaned from the Paris Commune. Frank, if you can speak to that.
Okay. Yeah, I think I can. what most revolutionaries learned from the Paris Commune, I think the Panthers also, at least some of the Panthers, it's hard to speak of the Panthers as a ideologically uniform group, because there was different ideological tendencies within the Panther Party. Very few were Marxist-Leninists. And I don't know how much the question of the Paris Commune even came up in the Panther Party. It didn't come up within the Panthers that I knew. But you know, one of the key lessons you've already spoken to, and that is, and some of us learn this in a negative way. You know, when are conditions such that you go into armed struggle? You know, when does it become necessary to pick up arms in order to prosecute the revolution? You know, and there was a lot of misunderstanding around that question. You know, and some of our people prematurely picked up arms. You know, because they had misjudged the situation. The Paris Commune, you know, they had no alternative, you know, but to pick up arms. We're not talking about the day-to-day interest, you know, the struggle for better conditions and whatnot, you know, reform had kind of been exhausted, you know, by virtue of the invasion and the betrayal of the national bourgeoisie, you know. But in the United States during the 60s, you know, there was that great, huge reform movement called the Civil Rights Movement that was going on. And obviously, you know, millions and millions of people were still going about methods of struggle that were peaceful and you know, not ready for armed struggle. And so a small group of people began to say that the peaceful methods had exhausted themselves, that you know, we had no recourse but to now take up arms, and that proved to be incorrect, you know, because it didn't really go anywhere, you know. But in the situation of the Paris Commune, the workers were in a position to seize power, and they did. The question was, did they go far enough? And our response is they did not, you know. And you've already addressed that, you know, that if you're going to overthrow the government, you have to overthrow it, you know? And set up in its place the dictatorship of the proletariat. The great lesson of the Paris Commune is the dictatorship of the proletariat. You know, we have to have the workers in control. We have to have our class enemies out of power and our people in power. You know, and sometimes it takes armed struggle to achieve that. I would be hard pressed to find a situation in the world then and in the world now where the dictatorship of the proletariat was achieved without armed struggle. I mean, every situation that I know about, that's how revolutionaries took power. It was as a result of armed struggle. But you know, not in an adventurous sense. We make sure that that the people are ready for that. You know, that the masses of our people are willing to take up armed struggle and make those sacrifices. To do it without the mass support, to do it without the backing of the people, is an act of adventurism, and a lot of that went on in the 60s, and unfortunately, the Panther Party was part of some of it. Is that okay?
Thank you very much for that, Frank. I think you highlighted some of the most important takeaways from this webinar in your summary. I will just ask if there are any final comments to add from our other panelists, Ezra, Franz, Joma. Would you like to add anything to this question of the lessons today in our social movements?
Yasmin, I will just say that Frank said it all. We need an armed revolution and we need to prepare our masses. That's what I feel that they are at the moment. You know, given the kind of politics that has been in the past decades, we really need to bring the masses to the point where everybody is willing to take on the most critical need of our times, and that's an armed revolution. Without that, there cannot be an overthrow of the bourgeoisie. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. And Professor Sison, any final words for us?
Well, I thank the ILPS for having me. This is a great opportunity for promoting proletarian internationalism by recalling the Paris Commune. This is actually proletarian internationalism, in my belief, it's the lodestar of international solidarity against the existing evils of imperialism and all forms of reaction against which the ILPS is fighting in terms of mass movement. No, so I thank you for putting together this webinar and further seminars in order to educate the masses so that they become sharper in fighting against imperialism and all reaction and aim for the socialist future.
Thank you very much, Kajoma, for that. And that brings us to the end of this webinar. We're going to share on our screen the upcoming events that will be happening across the next few months that the ILPS will be having. On next month, on the 10th, we've got one on the workers' movement. On the 25th of April, we've got the struggle of European workers. On the 9th of May, we have Women of the Paris Commune. And on the 22nd of May, we have a virtual tour of the Paris Commune, which will be going through Paris. And finally, on the 5th of June, we will have a webinar looking at applying the lessons of the Paris Commune. So to end, I would like to again thank all of our panelists for your wonderful contributions, and the interpreters especially for your crucial work to making international solidarity and these kind of webinars possible and as accessible as we can. We are truly grateful also for all of our participants. We have a great turnout to this, and also people watching on Facebook, and this will of course be available to watch back on Facebook and on our ILPS website. We've also noted all of the questions and we will send them to the panelists, so maybe they can be addressed in future writings or webinars. And once again, you can see the list of events that are upcoming over the next few months in the celebration of the Commune's 150th anniversary. Once again, thank you for participating in this launch, and we will see you at the next event. Long live the Paris Commune, and long live international solidarity.